Good morning and welcome to the Snowstorm. I'm Nicholas Snow, your host, and the Snowstorm is the quintessential LGBTQ plus Sunday show at 9 a.m. Pacific. And in today's important broadcast, we'll be talking about the historic settlement to roll back key discriminatory provisions in Florida's horrific Don't Say Gay law. I have a very exciting show for you today. It definitely meets the standard that I'm trying to set here with the Snowstorm, this new Sunday show. I want you to know that if you are watching live and have a question or comment, it may be featured on screen. Unless you are watching on Instagram, I cannot curate those comments onto my screen. Just want to tell you briefly, you can support my work for as little as $3 a month. Go to patreon.com/PromoHomo.TV. And be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel at youtube.com/PromoHomo.TV network. So, as announced this week, more than a dozen parents, students, and teachers throughout Florida, along with nonprofit organizations, Equality Florida and Family Equality, reached a historic settlement agreement with the Florida State Board of Education, Florida Department of Education, and school districts that resolves their challenge to Florida's Don't Say Gay law. The settlement restores the ability of students, teachers, and others in Florida schools to speak and write freely about sexual orientation and gender identity in class participation and schoolwork. It also restores safeguards against bullying on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity and reinstates gay-straight alliances, commonly referred to as GSAs. Critically, the settlement also requires the State Board of Education to send the agreement to every school district and to make clear that the settlement reflects the considered position of the state of Florida on the scope and meaning of this law. I have two amazing guests coming up, and we're going to do a deep dive into what this means and also the important work ahead in this episode of The Snowstorm. PromoHomo.TV is all about empowering you, our communities, and our world. Shouting out to my media partners. Pink Media, amplifying PromoHomo.TV across the Twitterverse with their #ILoveGay campaign. GayDesertGuide.lgbt. And KGay 1065 Palm Springs, available worldwide. Ask your smart speaker to play KGAY. Here's the deal, folks. We have two distinct choices. We can prepare ourselves to live under authoritarian rule, or we can do everything in our power to save democracy. And saving democracy is the precise reason I have launched The Snowstorm, your quintessential LGBTQ plus Sunday show at 9 a.m. Pacific. Find it at PromoHomo.TV. And if I was standing up right now, you would realize that over 6 feet of snow has hit your online viewing experience. So coming up on the show, Shannon Minter Esquire is the legal director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights, NCLR, one of the nation's leading advocacy organizations for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. NCLR is a nonprofit public interest law firm that litigates precedent-setting cases at the trial and appellate court levels, advocates for equitable public policies affecting the LGBTQ community, provides free legal assistance to LGBTQ people and their legal advocates, and conducts community education on LGBTQ issues. John Harris Maurer, I'll get a correction if I said that wrong, Esquire is Public Policy Director of Equality Florida. Strategically positioned in downtown Tallahassee, John literally keeps an eye on the Florida Capitol as Equality's public policy director. He previously served as Equality Florida's government affairs manager and in nearly every volunteer role, from petition signature gatherer to statewide board co chair. Equality Florida is Florida's statewide civil rights organization dedicated to securing full equality for Florida's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community. So, without further delay, I welcome to the show Shannon and John. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for giving up some of your Sunday morning, or in your case, John, afternoon. So I would like to go to you, John, and I'd like to go back to some of the emotional roots of this because you live in Florida, you've been fighting for LGBTQ equality there for a long time. And as we know, all these local fights are very much connected to what's going on in the national scene. And I'd like you to describe sort of the trauma that the LGBTQ plus community and their allies are experiencing in Florida as a result of the horrific actions, mostly by right wing Republicans.
Sure. Well, we're here to talk about a historic settlement for the challenge to the Don't Say Gay or Trans law. But you're right, Nicholas. That's really just one small part of a much broader censorship agenda that we've seen in Florida now for several years under the direction of Governor Ron DeSantis. It is not just limited, unfortunately, to LGBTQ issues. It's something that we're seeing really broadly, and it has serious impacts for our education system in a number of different sort of policy areas that we're following closely. So it is not just about controlling free speech and free ideas and representation in classrooms, but much more broadly. I mean, cracking down on protests, education across the board. We just saw headlines this week about the University of Florida dismantling all of its DEI programming and terminating those positions. This is going to have really long lasting impacts for Florida and Floridians that will far outlast Governor DeSantis's tenure. And it's having real impacts on Florida's reputation as well, as we've seen conferences leave the state, businesses making decisions not to relocate people to Florida because they're concerned about the environment that they would be stepping into and how it would impact their families and education of their young kids as well.
Thank you for that. And Shannon, would you like to add anything to what John has just said?
Well, yes, one thing I want to add is what a tremendously good job Equality Florida has been doing and trying to respond to all of this. I mean, it's been like talk about a snowstorm. This has been like a blizzard of hatred and viciousness from the legislature and the governor in Florida. It's been really almost overwhelming. The only thing I would add is, it's been particularly bad for transgender people in Florida lately. Just awful. I mean, Florida completely banned medical care for transgender kids. NCLR and other groups are challenging that in court right now. And then Florida is the only state thus far that has tried to restrict healthcare for adult transgender people, as well as like saying trans kids and teachers can't refer to themselves by the appropriate pronouns in class. Now trying to prevent transgender people from getting corrected ID markers on driver's license. So yeah, Florida is really uh, ground zero in the national attack on our community. And John Harris, I know it's not been easy to be on the ground there, and I just can't say enough about it. Y'all have shown such tremendous leadership and courage.
I appreciate you underscoring those impacts. I mean, what we know is, again, not just in a single piece of legislation, but in the broader legislative slate, this is about an intentional effort to exclude transgender Floridians from public life. When you have legislation that's targeting, how they can be legally recognized, where they can just use the bathroom and be respected in their workplace, even private workplaces. It is really a comprehensive campaign that is targeting a particular community just for political purposes.
Tell me, and this is to either one of you, and then the other one can piggyback on that. Tell me how the various legal advocacy organizations collaborate in general and specifically on this case.
Sure, I'll jump in, John Harris. You can follow up. Well, I think everyone, all of our national LGBT organizations recognize how important Florida is. And, we have tried to have like some kind of strategic coordinated response to what's going on there and kind of divide and conquer to a certain extent. So, uh, my organization, NCLR, worked with Equality Florida, Family Equality, and then a bunch of individual plaintiffs with the incredible law firm of Kaplan, Robbie Kaplan's law firm. And I hope people know who Robbie Kaplan is. Robbie Kaplan is one of the like just legendary civil rights attorneys of our time. She's the one who represented E. Jean Carroll suing President Trump for defamation. She has brought many, many very important civil rights cases, including going after the Klan in Charleston for their, attacks on protesters or civil rights activists in Charleston, South Carolina. Anyway, Robbie's firm is amazing. So
Kaplan Hecker and Fink LLP.
there you go. Yeah. So working with them on this case to challenge the Don't Say Gay or Trans law has been just the experience of a lifetime for me, honestly, professionally. It's just been amazing. Anyhow, there was actually a second lawsuit filed against the Don't Say Gay challenge by Lambda Legal, which I think definitely helped create some additional pressure. And then in terms of challenging all these other bad things that are happening in Florida, it's there's an array of different groups challenging different aspects of it. But John Harris, you probably have a perspective on that from inside the state.
Sure. The only thing I would add, in addition to, as Shannon mentioned, the litany of legal challenges that we've seen from the state propounding so many unconstitutional laws, and the victories that we've seen in some of those already. Again, the drag ban, various iterations of quote unquote stop woke legislation that have been struck down or put on hold by the courts, is that we know those legal challenges are incredibly important. In a state like Florida, there's not a lot of balance in the state legislature. There are supermajorities in both chambers. So the legislative work is constantly an uphill battle. But we know that working with legal partners like NCLR and outside firms like Kaplan Hecker that do outstanding work is something that we've got to keep in mind from the outset. So we are continuing to talk to our members, and that's more than 300,000 people across the state, about the importance of coming to the Capitol, telling your stories, making sure that we're turning out to these hearings, whether they're before the legislature or before different administrative regulatory bodies, and keeping in mind that much of this policy will go to the courts for litigation because it is so patently unconstitutional. And while we make those points in our testimony, it is often falling on deaf ears, or there's just a feeling that, the taxpayers, I guess, will open their collective pocketbooks to finance this legislation that's just about political ambitions. So our lawmakers or state leaders don't care that much that it will end up in the courts. But we get to work with these really just fabulous legal partners, crafting that strategy from the outset so that we can make sure we're getting the right things on the record to sort of lay the foundation for later legal challenges that show the discriminatory impact of these laws and the discriminatory intent for why they're being put forward.
Nicholas, can I just jump in and say, I think people in the community would be very encouraged and comforted if they knew the depth of the coordination and partnership between legal groups and Equality Florida and other advocacy groups on the ground. I mean, we're working so closely together, and I'll tell you something, like litigation on its own would not be successful without that partnership. And I think this Don't Say Gay case is like the penultimate example of that, because we filed a lawsuit. There was another lawsuit filed, as I mentioned a minute ago, but we would never have been able to have the atmosphere, the government, Florida state government would not have felt the pressure to reach a settlement in this case if it were not for Equality Florida and all the intense political activity and just exposure of what's behind that law and the terrible impacts it was having. If it wasn't for all of that public exposure, there's no way we could have settled this case as successfully as we did. So it really is a very intense strategic partnership.
Well, congratulations to all of the collaborators. I would like to ask you a personal question, John. Well, it's totally related to, what you're doing is um, you're wandering through hallways, government hallways, and you're coming up against people that literally hate you, that literally despise and have contempt for the LGBTQ community. How do you prepare yourself emotionally to work so diligently in that environment?
I appreciate the question. It is definitely a grueling atmosphere. My predecessor in the role used to describe it as trying to push a rock up a hill while somebody's punching you in the face. So there are the days when it is really difficult, but it's also really important work. And I'll say it feels like an honor to get to do it. I think I have the best job in Florida, as challenging an environment as it is, because the work is so important. Um, and so I draw a lot of satisfaction from that and the importance of being there in the fight. And really, our members, our volunteers, continue to show up really whenever we put out the call. And they are just a huge part of what keeps me going and motivates our whole staff. When they share their personal stories and they're, coming up to Tallahassee, that's not easy to get to, taking time out of their days, figuring out childcare, taking time off of work to be here and be part of the process. It is really empowering for all of us. And there is no question that it is shifting the dynamics. I mean, we saw that this year with the fight against a pride flag ban that we had introduced in Florida. And again, we had dozens of folks turning out, filling that room, telling their stories, and taking the time to educate lawmakers on just how harmful that legislation would be. And ultimately, the lawmaker basically screamed uncle and opted to temporarily postpone neither the House nor Senate. Was there another hearing on that bill? And it is because people were brave enough to come to the Capitol, again, share their stories and pour out their hearts, and even just putting, a face to these issues. It's so easy to demonize what people don't know. And I think where we've seen the most of that strength coming from is particularly Florida's trans community that has been so in the spotlight, and know that there are risks even from engaging at times, but understand just how important it is to be here and that they can have that impact. So seeing those directly impacted folks, seeing parents who continue to turn out because they know that they have to be here to advocate for their child is so motivating and empowering for our team, and for other Floridians to be able to see that even as all this vitriol is coming out of the legislature, there are members of the public and there are lawmakers who are, taking that time on the record to tell those folks how important their fight is, how important they are, and give them some of that faith and courage to keep going.
Shannon, how do you maintain your emotional strength in the work that you do?
Well, I get a lot of strength and inspiration from, the people that we represent. Uh, I have been blown away. We're unfortunately having to challenge these bans on medical care for transgender young people all over the country. And I've been truly stunned by the parents that we have met through these cases and that we're representing. I mean, talk about being under fire. I mean, they're trying to protect their children. They're in these very hostile environments. I mean, you just cannot even overstate how hostile these red states have become towards transgender people, but especially like just demonizing these parents and accusing them of abusing their children, of doing horrible things to their children. I cannot imagine what that feels like. I mean, it's gotta just cut right to the core. And somehow they have found the strength to be part of these lawsuits, which is a miserable experience. It is so hard. The state defendants in these cases are being terrible, honestly. They're being really awful and putting these families through hell, like keeping the parents, deposing them for hours and hours and hours. And in those depositions, like asking just god awful questions, like trying to accuse them of doing harmful things to their children. I couldn't do it. I will tell you what, I do not think I could put myself through that. So compared to that, what they're doing, my job, just being the lawyer in these cases, feels like a privilege and it feels easy. And it really does in the deepest possible way. It is a privilege to represent these families in our community. And I'm so glad to be able to do it.
And I think moments like this settlement are really gratifying for that effort because we see these parents, as mentioned, who will come and testify at the podium, sometimes physically shaking. I mean, it is not easy for folks to lean in this way. As Shannon mentioned, certainly, being a party to a lawsuit and living under that sort of scrutiny. But the tide is turning. We are turning the tide. And so I think it has at least been really helpful to folks to be able to see that, there's some return on that effort. It is a long road. We know that this is not about one case. It's not about one piece of legislation. But we're going to keep showing up and we're going to keep carving out wins because it's too important not to.
Well, I just am so grateful to both of you and all of those people that you work with, on the front lines. I think it's good to get into specifics. So the Don't Say Gay law has been broadly interpreted to just rule out any sort of affirmative support of the LGBTQ community in the Florida public school system. But the law, your victory, has been able to clarify that classroom references, the law does not prohibit references to LGBTQ plus persons, couples, families, or issues, including in literature, in classroom discussion, such as student to student speech, or teachers responding to students' questions, in students' academic work product, or teachers' review of the same, in teachers identifying same sex or transgender spouses or partners, or in any other context in which a teacher is not, quote, instructing, unquote, on the subject of sexual orientation or gender identity. I'm taking that language right after your celebratory announcement, but that's such a 180-degree turn from how they were interpreting that. And then the other specific items that were clarified have to do with non-discrimination, anti-bullying and acceptance, extracurricular activities, library books, and third parties. And what does third parties mean? Because that's one of the more obscure things on the list. The law does not apply to non-school personnel, including parents, other family members, and guest lecturers. So, as long as the school is not delegating to such third party the role of providing classroom instruction on the subjects of sexual orientation or gender identity, it's like your results were as close to getting rid of the law as it could have been.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to paint a little bit more of the picture of what we were seeing in Florida and then pass the mic to Shannon to talk a little bit more about just the historic achievements here. But it's really important to understand just how devastating this law was, not only because of the black letter that was sort of on the page, but because of its impacts and the way it was extended and being interpreted by these school districts. We really had a school district come out and say, if you're a same-sex teacher, you have to take that picture of a same-sex partner off your desk. Now, they walked back from that, but it's because this language was so ambiguous. And we saw multiple school districts say, you have to go out and peel those safe space rainbow stickers off of your doors and windows, those emblems that really help LGBTQ students who may be struggling to feel safe and respected and understood in those spaces. But because the law was so, I would say, intentionally ambiguous, the clarity that comes from this settlement is critically important for our school districts. And it brings with it, some things that we would be asking for from a Democratic administration, just because these things have never been recognized in law before, that schools can have a gay straight student alliance. And the way that, this lays the foundation to make sure that every student is protected and every family is being respected. It's what we were not seeing when this law was initially laid out. And our champion lawmakers did a great job, I will say, in the legislative process of trying to narrow the law and focus on, what the narrative was about what it was supposed to be achieving, and saying, look, if you're talking about making sure that people aren't teaching on different sexual activities, let's have an amendment that makes that law clear and spells it out in the legislation. And all of those efforts were routinely shot down by the leadership. And so we could see that the intent here was for this broad, sweeping, chilling effect, as we mentioned, sort of this censorship agenda, so that it wasn't just about, quote unquote, classroom instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity. It was this much broader attempt to push those identities aside and make sure that there was just no reference, no visibility at all for the community in these schools.
Shannon?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, when you're reading off that list of what this settlement does, Nicholas, I am so, it is just so thrilling to hear that, because I hope people understand what really happened here, because it is actually extraordinary. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever been a part of. But as John Harris said, we actually have ended up through this settlement and all the work that led to it and made it possible in a better position than we were before this law was passed, because the evil genius of this law, just as John Harris just explained so well, is it was deliberately ambiguous. There was a complete censorship agenda. That's the perfect phrase for it, John Harris, behind the law. The legislature knew if they had passed a law like the old style don't say gay laws that literally said you can't say anything positive about gay people in schools, that would have been immediately struck down. But instead, they did this ostensibly neutral thing where you can't have instruction about sexual orientation or gender identity. They didn't single out LGBT people. That on its face, that would apply to straight people and non-transgender people. And they knew very well that what the impact of that law would be is that everyone would think it meant you can't talk about LGBT people, and that you can't do all this other stuff. You can't have a safe space sticker. You can't have a picture of your spouse. If a student asks a question that raises the issue of LGBT people, you can't answer it. All these things. And it just struck fear in everyone's heart, and it had all these horrible impacts. And so the genius of this settlement is that we just held the state held their feet to the fire. Everything they said in the court case, because when we filed our challenge to this law and we're like, hey, judge, this law does all these terrible things. It is not being applied in a neutral, even-handed way. It's only being applied to silence any conversation about LGBT people. And the state was like, no, no, look, it says right here on the face of the law, it doesn't do that. They're like, so we would say it does this. And they'd be like, no, it doesn't. It does this. No, it doesn't. So that's what we did in this settlement, is basically force the state to stick to what they had said in binding legal papers filed with a federal court, that the law does not do all these negative things, that it literally, the only thing it does is, I guess the teacher can't come to class one day and say, today, class, we're going to learn about sexual orientation and gender identity, which was not something that was happening anyway. So, I mean, I am so thrilled with this. And it, by forcing them to put in writing all the things that teachers and school staff and students and parents and third parties, as you said, can do, that puts us in a place better than we were before it passed. Now it's all spelled out in great detail, all the different ways that teachers can support LGBT students and talk about LGBT issues, and students can too. So this to me is like an absolute textbook example, and an inspiring one, of how we can respond to the way we're being attacked in this moment. And we actually, if we do things right, we can end up in a better place than where we started. And I just want to say, I completely agree with John Harris. The tide is turning. It really is finally turning.
What would you like to add, John?
I think it's just worth noting that, again, these attacks and these type of attacks are not unique to the LGBTQ community. As mentioned, we've seen where sort of the tip of the spear in Florida, at least, though very clearly across the country, unfortunately, is pointing towards the transgender community and transgender youth. But when we look at things that are addressed in this settlement, like book banning, which we've seen rampantly across the state of Florida, that's not just about LGBTQ storylines and authors. I mean, we've seen a graphic novel adaptation of the Diary of Anne Frank be removed from classrooms, stories on Roberto Clemente and Rosa Parks. And so it is this much broader effort about sort of deciding which ideas are favorable or disfavored by the government and pursuing this agenda. And so a win like this is a really critical part of reversing that trend and pushing back and making sure that our classrooms, at least, if not our lawmakers, will be faithful to the Constitution.
Well, I'm going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I have a variety of viewer comments that I want to put on the screen, and then I want to give each of you the opportunity to add to our conversation anything that you want to make sure is part of this interview. The Snowstorm continues after this. PromoHomo.TV is all about This particular shirt is the crux of the Hopeful Sexual campaign, and it is designed to inspire authentic human connection while simultaneously combating sexuality-based shame and stigma. And the really cool thing is, if you go to hopefulsexual.com, it takes you to an Amazon store where this shirt is available in all sorts of styles, sizes, and colors. And I use the revenue to fund PromoHomo.TV. So check it out. I think almost everyone is a hopeful sexual, don't you? And to just throw it out here, Shannon and John, this is the most complimented shirt I've ever worn anywhere, just so you know. I'm speaking with Shannon Minter from NCLR and John Harris Maurer. Is it Maurer?
Maurer.
Maurer. Okay, thank you for correcting me. John Harris Maurer from Equality, Florida. And we have a variety of comments that have been popping up. And I always want to go to our viewers. Patrick, a regular viewer and member of the community and a friend of mine, wants to know, are Jewish students who are being harassed too being supported by the LGBT advocacy efforts? Do you know of specific targeted efforts to support Jewish LGBTQ students as part of your awareness of the advocacy work?
Sure. I would say we have partner organizations like Keshet that really focuses on the intersection of LGBTQ and Jewish identity. They're one of the organizations that has been up here in the Capitol with Equality Florida. When we host our Pride at the Capitol event, this year we brought about 200 people from around the state to come talk to their lawmakers about a variety of issues. And as I mentioned earlier, when we look at this slate of legislation and the censorship agenda, it is not just about the LGBTQ community by any means. We see a lot of these targeted attacks and attempts to sort of erase or invisibilize different people and different groups, and really, I think, take advantage of marginalization that already exists and stop sincere and difficult conversations about things like marginalization or a concept of privilege that are so important for understanding and building bridges between these communities. So it's certainly an important part of our advocacy work. We work with, I would say, a host of often progressive organizations in the Capitol and are showing up for each other's fights because we know that it is, again, not just about a single community, but it is a concerted effort that is pushing back against sort of our democratic norms.
Shannon, anything you want to add to that?
Just really quick note, what's coming to my mind is how proud I am of Robbie Kaplan and her law firm. I mean, Robbie is openly lesbian, very devoutly Jewish, and has done incredible work in challenging anti-Semitic hate groups all across the country. I'm just proud of a member of our community for stepping up to do that.
Thank you for that. So, Rob Dietrich is watching from Oklahoma, and Oklahoma has a "Don't Say Gay" law too, according to Rob. And evidently, there's efforts to pass stronger laws in Oklahoma. Shannon, do you know of any specific legal advocacy work on behalf of the LGBTQ plus community that's going on in Oklahoma?
There's a challenge to Oklahoma's again ban on medical care for transgender youth that has been filed and is actually up on appeal now to the 10th Circuit. We're looking all of the national legal groups, especially in the aftermath of the successful settlement of the Don't Say Gay challenge in Florida, to think about other ways we can leverage this in other states. Obviously, we need to get rid of these laws. They've been passed not just in Oklahoma, but in a number of other states, and they certainly need to be challenged. And we had hit a bit of a wall, frankly, in figuring out how to successfully do that. And I do think this settlement has, opened up some potential new avenues for creativity. So I would say that is a work in progress in the discussion amongst all the legal groups.
And I appreciate Rob invoking Next Benedict's name. And it's an important illustration of how these pieces of legislation, again, aren't just about the words on the page. It is about the environment that they're creating, and how much more hostile they make environments like schools, even for our LGBTQ youth, for transgender folks across the state and the states. And that these efforts to just sort of dehumanize and other people. And it gives so much license to hate and violence that obviously all of us should be opposing. And I think sometimes the politicians behind them don't appreciate just what an impact they have and how strong a signal they're sending beyond, again, just the words on the page.
Shannon, would you please tell our viewers more about the tragedy of Next Benedict's death and the context in which it occurred, and how come that is a clarion call for more action?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it's just been crushing. It has been absolutely crushing. Yeah, Next Benedict was a student in Oklahoma, identifies as non-binary, is a member of the Choctaw Nation, and had just been harassed endlessly at school. Had been suffered years, I believe, of being bullied and picked on and harassed. And it wasn't just Next; a lot of other kids had the same experience there. And the school district, to say the least, was completely indifferent. And now we have this state superintendent of education in Oklahoma who has been saying incredibly hateful anti-transgender, anti-gay statements, and has even partnered up with people completely outside the state. The very toxic person that runs that Libs of TikTok campaign. You're just it's stunning. What in the world? This is basically a hate campaign being launched from a state education official who's supposed to be caring about the safety and welfare of all the kids in Oklahoma schools. So I think this we need to honor the death of this young person who, yes, so Next was harassed at school, attacked in a bathroom by 3 other kids, and died the next day. There's been a lot of confusing information about the cause of death. Initially, it's thought it might be as a result of the beating that Next took. There's now a medical examiner report saying it was death by suicide. The family is questioning that. I don't think we know the exact cause of Next's death, but we do need to know that as important information. But whether it was the result of the beating or it was by suicide or something else, what matters is this is a life that was lost, a young person who was in real trouble and despair and was not being helped in any way by the responsible adults around them, the school officials who have instead fostered a hostile, toxic, vicious culture for these young people. And just, I feel like the community, this death has really just done something collectively, and people are like, enough is enough. I think we're going to look back on this as a real turning point, and that we're going to see levels of commitment, organization, activity nationwide that will put a stop to this most years long now campaign of hatred against transgender kids in particular. I really do feel that. I feel like a new energy and resolve has happened as a result of this tragic death that should never have happened.
And I
Anything you want
think,
to add, John?
yeah, I mean, it is so heartbreaking how much of this is tied to the school environment and a place that should be safe and supportive for all of our kids, including LGBTQ youth. And it's a place where we've seen a renewed campaign, or maybe just a new campaign, where these administrative agencies are being pulled into these culture war fights in a way that we didn't see prior to maybe 3 years ago. Florida, for a long time, has been very familiar with these anti-LGBTQ fights in the legislature. But now we're seeing how the governor has weaponized these different state agencies, whether it's the Department of Education, the state Medicaid agency, the Department of Health, all of these different apparatuses of government or bodies of government that are now being pointed and targeted towards the LGBT community and other communities in a way that we just didn't see before, and that Floridians should have been able to rely on these organizations or these bodies to just focus on using their professional expertise to serve the good of the people of Florida. And it is, again, to your question of sort of preserving democracy, a trend that we've got to reverse, because these agencies shouldn't be weaponized like this against any community.
Uh, so, so many things that are on the table for us to fight. Um, John and then Shannon, what would you like to add to anything we've talked about, bringing it back to the case? So anything that you want to add that you would like to say that we haven't discussed so far that you want to reemphasize?
Well, I'll jump in first and just underscore that while this is certainly a legal triumph, it's so important as a beacon of hope and an illustration of what we can do together to push back against these efforts that we're seeing, again, certainly not just in Florida, but across the country. And we've had so many of those fights, at least that I can speak to in Florida. It really is an important marker, I think, for folks to see that there is power in our collective action, that we can take some of this back. And, a settlement like this is a step towards repairing some of the damage done by this law. It's not everything that can't be undone with, a single legal filing, unfortunately, but it's a really important step, and one that we're so grateful to have had, our brave plaintiffs take part in, our terrific legal partners, really achieving such a great step in the right direction here.
And Shannon?
I just want to say, as a transgender man, as somebody who had a horrible time when I was growing up, was very bullied in high school, was afraid for my life in high school, and just went through a lot to even figure out who I am, and then to be able to get medical care to transition and all that. And I'm now living back in Texas where I grew up. I just really have so much feeling right now for other LGBT people who are living in these red states, ones we've been talking about, including now John Harris. Kind of Florida is more reddish than purple these days. And if you'd asked me this time last year, am I hopeful? I would have struggled to come up with a yes answer to that. But I just want to underscore what John Harris just said. Don't give up. I know it feels so isolating and lonely and hard, But I do believe that because we have been fighting back so diligently, and because the bad guys have gone to such extremes, people are now genuinely recoiling from the cruelty and the harm that these laws are inflicting. And I can feel the tide is turning. This settlement was a huge step forward, but it's not going to be the last one. So I think now of all times, hang in there and don't give up. I really do believe the end of this particular period of persecution of our community is nearing an end.
And I think if Equality Florida's executive director Nadine Smith were here, she would invoke this metaphor of the slingshot and this idea that we've been pulled back for so long and so far with this terrible legislation, again, across the country, not only in Florida, but there's that moment when the slingshot snaps back and you are propelled further than we ever could have thought. And I think things like this settlement are part of that shift change. And as Shannon was saying, people understanding where this is going, sort of seeing what is at stake here and what's happening behind the curtain, and saying enough is enough. And getting some of the wins like this settlement has, that again are what we would be asking for from a blue administration. And so there is that chance to emerge so much stronger. And Nadine invokes the Barbara Streisand effect, which she would say is not just because it's the gayest example she could think of, but this idea that Google was mapping the whole California coast, and that included Barbara Streisand's property. She found out about it, was very mad, and sued them in court to stop publication of these images. And of course, before the lawsuit, I don't know, 40 people had ever seen it. And because of the lawsuit, it was seen tens of thousands of times, if not millions of times, which was the exact opposite intent of the lawsuit. But I think that's sort of what we're seeing with these attacks in Florida as well, and across the country. Again, they're forcing us to tell these stories, to educate people on, what it is like to be a trans person or to be a parent who's just struggling to get proper medical care that's widely accepted for your kids. And so we're being forced through this really difficult moment that is hard. And I don't want to minimize that. I mean, we're seeing families leaving the state of Florida because of how traumatic this is, even as we're starting to carve out some of these wins. But we are having to do that work because the state has shown a spotlight on particularly the trans community. So this is both the challenge and the opportunity for us to correct some of that misinformation or just that lack of information that has made it so easy for them to target this community.
Well, thank you both. John, I just had the Equality Florida website on the screen. I'm going to put the NCLR website back up as well. About the third time in the broadcast I've done that. So this is the second episode of the Snowstorm on Sundays. I did 36 nightly episodes beginning January 1st and decided to switch to the weekly format. One of the reasons is because I don't think that these types of conversations are being had to the extent that they need to. And I would like to know, John, how has this victory been played in the Florida media? What media attention is this victory getting?
This has garnered tremendous media attention, not just in Florida, but nationally. I mean, we saw just how big the Don't Say Gay or Trans fight became. And it really was something that was an international focus of media attention. I mean, we had outlets in Australia covering it. I was in Amsterdam and saw it covered in a magazine there. And so this settlement is a really important part of that story, and it's getting a lot of coverage. And I would say, we've seen the state sort of try to couch this as not being a loss for them. But I think folks can just look at the sort of litany of outcomes here and understand why this is so important and how significant it will be for our LGBTQ youth and our LGBTQ families and educators when they now have this list of basically clarified rights that they can hold up in schools to make sure, again, that every student is being protected and all those families are respected.
It really is quite astounding that everything that was so vague and being banned is now codified as okay, as Shannon was saying. Shannon, how do you feel about the national media coverage of this story?
I think it's been very good. There's a little bit of the DeSantis government trying to desperately spin it back their way. And I've seen a little bit of that in some of the national press, but I think on the whole, people understand what just happened here. And one thing I've noticed is a bunch of the right wing groups, of course, follow these issues, are very unhappy with the DeSantis administration for this settlement. So I think that speaks volumes.
Well, I think it would be wonderful to sort of wrap everything up with a quote from lead counsel Roberta Kaplan, who said this week: "For nearly 2 years, Florida's notorious Don't Say Gay law has spawned a disturbing wave of fear, anxiety, and confusion. By providing much needed clarity, this settlement represents a major victory for the many thousands of LGBTQ plus students, teachers, parents, and their allies throughout Florida." Kaplan continues, "Today's settlement makes clear the legitimacy of gay student groups, safeguards against hate and bullying, and the ability of LGBTQ plus students and teachers to openly draw or display pictures of their partners and families. Simply put, the state of Florida has now made it clear that LGBTQ plus kids, parents, and teachers in Florida can, in fact, say that they are gay. We cannot overemphasize our gratitude for the courage of our clients, the 19 plaintiffs who stood up against prejudice and hate, even within their own local communities." I just want to say that my heart goes out to anybody experiencing bullying. I'm a 61-year-old man, and I still experience the adverse effects of the bullying that I went through as a kid. And that's why I wanted to open the show with a discussion of trauma. I believe that there's a tremendous amount of trauma in the LGBTQ plus community that has not been uncovered, discovered, or addressed. And I think that it's important to own it and to acknowledge what people are going through and to put the human face on all of this, which was, the whole premise of National Coming Out Day. At the time National Coming Out Day was launched, the research was showing that people that knew they knew someone who was a member of the LGBTQ plus community would support us, and people who did not know that they knew one of us would not be as likely to support us. So I want to thank you both for being on the show, and I'm going to give you each a final comment. Let's go with you first, John.
I thank you for the opportunity to share this great news and to help ensure that more folks know about it. As Shannon mentioned, we know that this will have important impacts, not just in Florida, but around the country for the precedent that it sets. And we're so excited for our families and students in Florida who now have the freedom, not just to say gay or trans, but to be gay or trans and know that they can share themselves authentically in classrooms, have those discussions, talk about their families. I think about my daughter in the schools and the classrooms that she'll grow up in, and I want to make sure that she feels seen just like any other kid. And I think that because of the tremendous work, again, of our legal partners and the plaintiffs who joined in here, that will be the case. And I'm so grateful to everybody for that.
Well, thank you, John and Shannon.
Nicholas, I just thank you for the show. I think what you're doing is wonderful. I just say I've seen so many positive changes since I was a kid, growing up. And I talked about, joining the club. I also still very much feel the effect of the trauma of being bullied and harassed as a child and rejected by my family and all that. But I'm proud of myself for addressing that and overcoming that and ending up having a wonderful, happy life. And I'm proud of our community. We come from a very strong community, you all. We've suffered a lot for sure, but we have overcome a lot. And the main thing I love about the LGBT community, and I hope we never lose it, is our compassion for others who've gone through similar mistreatment, and just our resilience and our refusal to ever give up. So it's just a privilege and wonderful to spend this time with you all this morning. And that's it.
Well, thank you again. Both of you are 0 degrees of separation from multiple people that would be appropriate to be guests on this show. So I'd like to invite you to tell them about it and ask them to reach out to me if they feel like this platform would be beneficial to them. Because I am committed to being here every Sunday morning, at least through November, because we have a lot of work to do. So thank you again. And thanks everyone at home for watching. I will see you next Sunday.
In a safe place, I got room to breathe. Been a long chase, but at last I'm free. These open woods, I knew I could find peace here. Nothing like the city where I got tired of the running, the catching up. I got hungry for the stunning high mountain tops. So I made some plans, some dreams to catch, to promised lands, to find my path. See the planet from greater heights. I have found a place out of time and space, far from city lights, up on greater heights. See the blue sky, feel the wind that blows. Get the